Hello, in this lecture we want to talk about the history of Israel and Judah. We're going to do this from the perspective of what might be called critical or secular history. In a different video we looked at the salvation history or the biblical account of the people of Israel and Judah. But this lecture we want to look more from the resources and sources that might inform a history that would be common to any nation, regardless of whether you had a Bible or not. What was primarily the political history of these two nations? Here I provide you with a timeline with the key events, some of the key events, mainly related to some catastrophe in the life of the community. First off, you have the 722 when the Assyrians, the world power, came and destroyed the northern kingdom. And while the southern kingdom of Judah survived, it was not so much longer, a couple hundred years later, that it was destroyed by the Babylonians and the leaders put into exile. The difference between the two experiences was that the southern kingdom was rescued, was restored, because Persia, modern-day Iran, rose up and defeated Babylon, modern-day Iraq, and allowed the Jews to return back to their home country. We're going to walk through these different periods in time, so we won't spend a lot of time here with this map and chart, but we just want to make one comment. Notice you have Israel to the north and Judah to the south. We tend to think of that as one nation. They really, for most of their history, were two nations. Only very briefly were they united prior to the exile, and even after the exile, really Israel is more constrained to the south pretty much until later in its history, which we'll talk about at a later point. But what I want to say is we should think about Israel and Judah much like we might think today about Canada and the United States. Sharing the same culture, sharing even the same religious religion in many ways, at least religious religions, and the same kind of governments. And the difference being not cultural but political. And just as today there would be no Canadian who'd want to be called an American, a U.S. citizen, maybe say so too in that day as well. I don't think an Israelite would want to be called a Judahite, and vice versa. So there is a distinctive political identity between these two nations, and that's important to realize. We sometimes blur them together as one, but in reality they had distinct sort of identities from each other. Here provides a map that gives you the major nations, which is sort of helpful, and the neighbors that surround Israel and Judah. As we walk through, what we're going to walk through is the different periods of time, and we'll see different ones of these nations dominating Israel and Judah at different points in history. The easiest way and an important way that biblical scholars divide up the history of Israel and Judah is the Pre-Exilic, Exilic, and Post-Exilic periods. Now, first thing we should notice is that's defined by Judah's experience, since the northern kingdom was sent into exile in 722, but this chart here obviously focuses upon Judah's exile and return as the center cornerstone there. So really Pre-Exilic is anything before 600 BCE, and then you have the Exilic period, which we mentioned already, where the leaders of Judah were sent into captivity in Babylon, but then later restored in 536. There's two phases of that exilic period. In 598, there's one deportation, and then a more thorough deportation and destruction of the temple in 587, or some people date that at 586. And then you have the post-exilic period. This is sort of interesting. We can certainly date it upon the return of the people of Israel. You could start that date at 536, but most people date it once, it's a little lag time there of return, and that's why I have the 532 date there. When you end it is an interesting question. Some people would end the date of the post-exilic period with the conquering of Israel, of Judah in 333 by Alexander the Great, or 338 by Alexander the Great, because now you enter the Hellenistic period. Other people would continue the post-exilic period to 164, when you have the Maccabean revolt and you have the reassertion of independence by the people of Israel, Judea. Others would wait until 63 when the Romans take control. And then there's even another option, which is you don't end the post-exilic period until the coming of Christ. So ending date kind of depends upon your author, how they see the extent of the post-exilic period. But let's start with the pre-exilic. What do we know about this period? Well, first off, for about 1500 to 1200 BCE, the regional power that dominated the area of Israel, which would be up here, and of Judah, down here, was Egypt. And from the written records, we don't hear about a people called Israelites or Jews or anything like that. We have Canaanite vassal princes who are controlling the various urban areas. But they do talk about these Apiru rebels that are causing them problems. People live up in the highlands, which you can see listed up here, who keep raiding their towns and their trade routes. Some scholars will claim that might Apiru, Hebrew. You can hear the difference even in English. Some people say there's a connection there. Other people think maybe that the people of Israel came not from, or the Hebrew people came not from that Apiru group that live up here in the mountains, but rather Sashu that live here on the Sinai Peninsula and doing the same thing. They're raiding trade routes or what have you. And they see that this group that were called the Sashu might be the Hebrews, and it would be represented by the biblical traditions of Numbers that we see in Exodus and Numbers, of the wandering in the desert. And that's sort of a, if you will, a secular description of this group of people who are living in the Sinai Peninsula area and raiding trade caravans and what have you. During this time period, we do have a sense of what the religious customs were in the area of Israel and Judah, because we have Ugaritic texts that have been dug up, and they talk about how they worship or what have you. We've talked about some of those practices in other videos. Well, after a while, the Egyptian power starts to shrink. A group of people called the Philistines take advantage of that. There's two arguments where the Philistines came from. They're outsiders. They either came from Crete or Cyprus. You get arguments both ways. This group of sea travelers tried actually to come down into Egypt. They get repelled by the Egyptians, and so they land and occupy this neck of the Mediterranean Sea, clinging to the coastline here, and start expanding inside Judah and Israel. And we'll talk a little bit more about them. They become the big power, and we see that in the biblical text. This is what causes the people of the 12 tribes to say we got to have a more efficient governmental system to respond to this threat than just our 12 tribe confederacy. All right, and what we do see is during this time the highlands start to become occupied more. So sort of a sense that maybe these Philistines are pushing what we will call the Israelites back into these highlands. And but what's interesting is their culture doesn't seem that different than the people living in the lowlands. So even if they're distinct in terms of ethnic identity, they're not distinct in terms of culture significantly. Maybe religiously, but not in terms of housing structures and things like that per se. Although you get debates within archaeology even on that point. And then, really, from the secular sources, it's pretty clear that Israel, the kingdom of the north, was the bigger dog in the neighborhood than Judah to the south. Even though the biblical texts focus upon Jerusalem and Judah, Israel to the north was a major military power in a way that Judah never was. And we have various dynasties that rise up and in the north. Even just to take a look at the economic life from the archaeological record, clearly there's more wealth in the north and what have you. Then, after, as we already kind of mentioned, at one point the Assyrian Empire expands and destroys the northern kingdom. That was more of a threat than the south, as we already kind of had mentioned. There were a couple incursions from the Assyrians. A major incursion coming in the 730s, but then the kind of the final blow to the northern kingdom when they rebelled again against the Assyrians, trying to push them back, came in 722, where Samaria was destroyed, the capital city, and the leaders were put into exile. Up to that point, they hadn't put people in the military and religious and political and economic leaders into exile. They simply occupied the land through occupation, through warfare. All right. At that point, the data that we have shows that Judah survives. It doesn't get destroyed, but it does become a vassal state to Assyria. What does that mean? It means that you are giving tribute, yearly tribute to the king, and that if the king says, I need you to send us some troops, you'll do that. That had been the relationship that Israel had with Assyria, and which they had tried to cast off as well, and which led to their destruction. Judah had joined in some of those resistant movements as well, but survived this incursion from the Assyrians. They were destroyed like the Israelites were. So here's three major periods within the history of the northern kingdom of Israel. We have the Amorite dynasty, then the Yehu dynasty, and then finally this period of quick succession when they really are weakened, which makes them, very vulnerable to the Assyrians, and finally they're destroyed. There's data, archaeological data. I'm not going to walk through all this because of time, but some important data related to the Amorite dynasty. The Tel Dan stele is important because it refers to the house of David. That's the first earliest documentation we have that talks about the house of David. And we also have a mention of the Amorite dynasties being pushed back by the Moabites in the Moabite stone. So some texts that sort of indicate this dynasty starts to fall. It's replaced by the dynasty of Yehu. He seems to have come to power by becoming a vassal, letting the Assyrians know, hey, fight on my side and I'll be a good compliant king and vassal. And so that's how you have that switch in the dynasty and the houses, the dynasty houses within the northern kingdom. In the south, you only have one dynasty, and that's the Davidic dynasty, that lasts really from the time of what in the biblical accounts described as the United Monarchy all the way to the Babylonian Exile, which is one reason why I think people of Judah see that God's on their side, is that their house doesn't change. They're not, dealing with this constant internal turmoil to the same extent as is happening to the north. As I already mentioned, we have the exilic period, though, coming up. Briefly, there's a reassertion of Egyptian power, and that correlates to the weakening of the Assyrians. But then that only lasts for a brief time, because in that power vacuum, Babylon starts to reassert itself, or to assert itself, and we come into the exilic period. And so during really around 605 until Babylon's destruction by Persia, it dominates this region. And then we move to the post-exilic period, as already mentioned. Persia becomes the dominant power. It allows the people of Judah to return back to Jerusalem and to their homelands. And this is seen as the action of God in the people's experience. And then we move into the Greek period, the growth of the kingdom from the time of Alexander the Great, and it extends beyond his death. But then that's superseded by the Maccabean period, and then finally the Roman period, which we'll talk about later. You might want to go to this nice little quick overview of the history of the different empires. It's kind of nicely done. You can see the URL provided there if you want a quick summary of exactly what we went through in 90 seconds. All right, so that gives you a quick overview of the different political powers that existed during the time of the biblical period of the Old Testament. This will be significant as we walk through the books because that's the background, the political realities that these books are responding to in many ways shape their experience of God's providence, of God's care, and of God's protection and correction as well. So we'll talk more about that later on.